Todd Hardy placed both hands on the conference table and told Susan she had 6 days to leave her own house. He kept his voice low, the way people do when they want cruelty to sound reasonable. "I'm not trying to make this harder than it is," he said. Sandra already scheduled the locksmith for Friday. Susan looked at Larry's son, then at the will lying between them. The paper was older than her marriage. Larry had signed it when Todd was still young, and Holly had only recently started school. It left everything to his children, with Todd named executor. Nothing in the document mentioned Susan, not the small house on Glover Street where she'd cared for Larry through 6 years of heart disease, not the savings she had stretched between specialist appointments, not Hardy Wilderness Guiding, the little family business she had helped keep alive after Larry could no longer manage the books. Peter Castro wasn't in that room yet. Susan didn't know his name. She didn't know there were papers elsewhere that would change what everyone thought Larry owned. At that moment, all she knew was that her husband had been dead for 9 days, and his son had brought an old will to an attorney's office in Twisp. The attorney, a tired man named Dale Mercer, sat at the end of the table. His reading glasses rested halfway down his nose. "There are procedures we have to follow," he said. "The court still has to confirm the appointment." "But the house is part of the estate," Todd said. "It appears to be. And I'm responsible for protecting estate property." Mercer glanced toward Susan. He didn't agree with Todd exactly, but he didn't stop him either. Holly sat beside the window with her coat folded over her lap. She had cried at the funeral. She had held Susan for several seconds in the church entry, then stepped away when Todd called her name. Now she watched the bare branches outside as if somebody might give her permission to leave. Susan folded her hands over her purse. "When did Larry make this?" she asked. Mercer checked the first page. 1995. He and I married in 1997. "Yes." "He never changed it?" "No. Later will has been presented." That wasn't the same as no later will existing, but Susan couldn't make her mind hold the difference. She had slept perhaps 12 hours in the past week. Her shoulders still carried the ache of the hospital chair. In her purse was a folded parking receipt from Central Washington Hospital, though she no longer needed it. Todd tapped the asset list. "The place on Glover is straightforward. The accounts are straightforward. The business equipment will need appraisals." Susan turned toward him. "Your father's ashes are still in that house. I know. His clothes are still hanging in the bedroom. I'm not saying you can't take your things." "My things?" Todd's mouth tightened. Sandra had told him to stay calm, not because she cared about Susan's grief, but because anger created delays. Their construction company was carrying debt from 2 unfinished houses and a supplier who had stopped extending credit. Todd had spent the previous year moving money between accounts and calling it temporary. Larry's estate looked like the one clean solution left. "We'll make sure everything personal gets separated," he said. Susan waited for Holly to look at her. Holly finally did. "I can help you pack," she said. It was a weak offering, and Holly knew it. Susan knew it too. "What about Wolf Creek?" Todd asked Mercer. The attorney sorted through the property pages. 40 acres with an old cabin. It came to your father from your grandfather's estate. "That mud lot? It has delinquent taxes." "How much?" Mercer gave him the figure. It wasn't enormous beside the Glover Street house, but it was enough to make Todd lean back. "The access is bad," Todd said. "There's no maintained driveway. Dad said half of it stayed wet until July." "He said that when?" Susan asked. Todd looked annoyed by the question. "Years ago. Larry had mentioned the Wolf Creek place only a few times. His father had lived there before the road was properly graded. After the old man died in 1996, Larry inherited the 40 acres and the cabin. He went up occasionally to clear windfall or check the roof. Susan had gone with him twice during the first years of their marriage. Later, work got busy. Then Larry's health failed, and a neglected cabin on a rough road became one more thing they meant to deal with someday. Todd pushed the property sheet away. "I don't want it. As executor, you can't simply ignore an estate asset," Mercer said, "then transfer it to her." Mercer looked from Todd to Susan. Todd continued before either could answer. "She needs somewhere to go. She can have that." Holly drew a breath. "Todd, what?" "It's a house. It's a cabin with holes in the roof. Then she can sell the land. You just said nobody would want it. I said I don't want it." Susan watched them argue over the place as though she had already left the room. Todd wanted the house, the accounts, the trucks, the guiding permits, the equipment, and anything else that could be sold. The one thing he offered was The thing that cost money and looked useless. Mercer took off his glasses. There's a county notice attached. If the back taxes aren't handled within 60 days, the parcel may proceed toward auction. Todd pointed toward the paper. There. She can take it with the taxes. Put that in writing. Susan had spent 6 years making sure Larry's pills went into the right compartments. She knew the sound his breathing made when fluid began building around his heart. She could lift a folded wheelchair into the back of their Subaru without twisting her spine. She had learned which insurance representative would return a call and which one required 3 messages. None of that gave her an answer in the attorney's office. Todd took her silence for acceptance. "We're doing you a favor," he said. Susan stood carefully. Her knees had stiffened during the meeting. "No," she said. "You're giving me what you believe has no value." Nobody replied. That silence was the one honest thing in the room. 3 weeks earlier, before anyone said executor or asset schedule, Susan had been standing at the kitchen counter on Glover Street with a pill bottle in one hand and a piece of toast in the other. Larry sat at the table wearing an old green fleece jacket. The house was warm, but he had been cold most mornings that winter. His field flask stood near his elbow, dented aluminum with a dark canvas strap. He hadn't carried it into the mountains for years. He still filled it whenever Susan drove him to Wenatchee, though there were perfectly good travel bottles in the cupboard. "Your morning pills," she said. "I'm working up to them. They're not a hill, they look like one." She put the toast in front of him. "Eat half, then climb." He smiled and took the pills. At 67, Larry had lost weight around his face and gained it around his ankles. Heart disease had changed him by degrees. First he stopped guiding the longer routes. Then he stopped guiding completely. He gave up driving after a dizzy spell near Pateros, though he complained each time Susan took the keys. She never reminded him that she had been doing most of the driving anyway. That morning, he managed 3 bites of toast. Then he set it down and pressed his fingers against the center of his chest. Susan saw the movement. "How long?" "It's nothing." "How long, Larry?" "A few minutes." She checked his color. His lips looked gray. "Get your shoes." "I'm already wearing shoes." "Then get your coat." He tried to stand and had to sit again. Susan called emergency services. She unlocked the front door, put his medication list into her purse, and moved the dining chair so the paramedics could bring in the stretcher. While she waited, she knelt beside him. "Stay with me. I'm here. I mean it. So do I." The ambulance took him to the small clinic first. By afternoon, he was being transferred to Wenatchee. Susan followed in the Subaru with her suitcase in the back, because experience had taught her never to believe a hospital stay would be only one night. Larry remained in the hospital for 3 weeks. During the first week, he complained about the coffee and asked Gary Bell to check the lock on the guiding shed. During the second, he stopped asking when he could go home. Susan sat beside him through rounds, medication changes, scans, and quiet conversations that never used the word dying until everyone already understood it. Todd visited twice. Sandra came once and spent most of the hour answering messages. Holly drove over after work on 3 evenings and brought soup Susan couldn't taste. Gary arrived with a paper bag of apples and stood awkwardly near the foot of the bed. "You look terrible," Larry told him. "So do you." Then we're even. Gary was 67, broad through the shoulders, with silver hair he cut himself. He and Larry had worked survey lines together before either of them had enough sense to turn down winter jobs. They had also run guided trips during the busy seasons. Gary had retired from the Forest Service, but he still repaired equipment in a machine shed behind his house. He picked up the field flask from Larry's bedside table. "You still carrying this old thing? It doesn't leak. It absolutely leaks. Only if you turn it upside down. That's one of the standard positions for a flask." Larry smiled, but his eyes moved towards Susan. She was sorting clean socks into the cabinet and didn't notice. Gary did. He set the flask down exactly where it had been. On the final evening, the ICU lights were dimmed. Snow pressed against the windows in soft, wet clumps. Larry had been awake for only a few minutes at a time. Todd stood near the door. Holly held her father's hand. Susan sat closest to the bed, one palm resting over Larry's wrist. His eyes opened. "Home?" he whispered. Susan leaned toward him. "Not tonight." He looked past her, toward something he couldn't quite focus on. "Wolf Creek," he said. Todd shifted near the door. Susan thought Larry was confused. He had been given medication, and his words sometimes came loose from the moment. "What about Wolf Creek?" she asked. Larry turned his hand beneath hers. His fingers closed weakly around two of hers. Don't let it go. She thought he meant the old cabin because it belonged to his father. She thought he was asking her to keep a family memory from being sold. She didn't know how she could promise that. She didn't own it. All right, she said anyway. I won't. Larry settled after that. He died before dawn, with Susan beside him. The hospital returned his belongings in a clear plastic bag. His watch was stopped, though it only needed winding. His glasses were folded inside a paper envelope. The field flask lay at the bottom, beside one clean sock and a comb with 3 gray hairs caught between its teeth. Todd met Susan outside the elevator. I can take Dad's things, he said. Susan held the bag closer. I've got them. I meant so. You don't have to carry everything. I've got them. He looked through the plastic. Is that his survey flask? Yes. He dragged that thing everywhere. He liked it. Todd shrugged. Keep it if you want. It's junk. Susan said nothing. She carried the bag to the parking garage, set it beside her suitcase, and drove home alone through the snow. For the next 9 days, she moved through the Glover Street house by habit. She washed Larry's coffee cup and put it in the cupboard. She woke at 2 in the morning to check whether he needed medication. She bought milk, forgetting there was only one person to drink it. Then came the funeral, the old will, and Todd's 6-day deadline. By Wednesday, cardboard boxes covered the living room. Holly came to help, as promised. She wrapped dishes in newspaper and kept finding reasons to carry full boxes to the car. Each trip let her avoid looking at Susan. Todd had marked furniture with strips of blue painter's tape. The dining set stayed. The bedroom dresser stayed. Larry's old survey maps stayed because Todd thought they might have value to collectors. Even the brass lamp beside Susan's chair wore a blue strip. You bought that lamp, Holly said. I don't have the receipt. He knows you bought it. That isn't the same as proving it. Holly pulled off the tape. Susan put it back. I'm not fighting over a lamp. You should fight over something. Susan looked around the room. Is that what you're doing? Holly's face reddened. I told Todd this was too fast. But you came with boxes. I didn't know what else to do. Susan folded one of Larry's sweaters. It still held the shape of his shoulders. You could tell him no. He won't listen to me. That's different from you not saying it. Holly sat on the edge of the sofa. Todd's in trouble. Susan stopped folding. What kind of trouble? Business trouble. He took on those houses outside Winthrop. Costs went up. One buyer walked away. And that gives him my home? I didn't say that. You came close. Holly rubbed her palms together. He thinks Dad promised the business would be his. Larry gave him work whenever he asked. I know. He gave him the newer truck. I know. He covered a payroll shortage last spring. Holly hadn't known that. Susan saw it in her face. How much? Holly asked. Enough that Larry and I postponed fixing this roof. Holly stared toward the ceiling. Todd arrived an hour later with Sandra. They walked through the rooms, checking the taped furniture. Sandra carried a yellow legal pad. Her hair was pulled tightly behind her head, and she had already called an estate dealer in Spokane. The dealer can come Monday, she said. Anything you're taking needs to be out before then. Susan stood beside the kitchen table. I was told Friday, for the locks. Monday is the contents. Sandra looked toward the clear ICU bag on the counter. The flask showed through the plastic. Is that going with you? Yes. Fine. Todd opened a drawer and checked inside. Susan watched him handle the place where she had kept dish towels for 29 years. What about the Wolf Creek transfer? She asked. Mercer's drawing it up, he said. You'll assume the taxes and any liability. You wanted it, right? You offered it. Same result. Not quite. Sandra tapped her pen against the pad. Susan, nobody's trying to put you on the street. Susan looked at the boxes, the taped chairs, and Todd's hand inside her kitchen drawer. Where do you think I'm going on Friday? Sandra had no answer ready. Todd shut the drawer. The cabin is there, he said. Have you seen it lately? No. Do you know whether the roof holds water? It's still a building. Is there electricity? There used to be. Running water? There's a well. That wasn't my question. Todd exhaled. What do you want me to say? For one hard second, Susan wanted him to say he remembered the 6 years she had kept his father alive. She wanted him to remember every holiday meal, every birthday card, and every time she had defended him after Larry called him careless. She wanted Holly to stand up. She wanted Larry to walk in and explain why he had left her exposed to this. Instead, Susan picked up the ICU bag. "I want you to finish the transfer," she said, "and once you do, I want you to stay off the property." Todd gave a short laugh. "Gladly." Friday morning, the locksmith's van pulled up at 9. Susan had already loaded the Subaru. Her suitcase lay flat in the back. 3 boxes of clothes were stacked beside a bag of groceries. She took Larry's ashes, 2 framed photographs, the lamp, and the clear ICU bag. Holly stood on the front walk with her hands in her coat pockets. "You can stay with me," she said. "For how long?" "As long as you need, and when Todd comes over." Holly looked down. Susan touched her arm. "You're not ready to choose. I can't live inside that." Todd came out carrying an envelope. He handed Susan the signed transfer papers and the county notice. "You've got 60 days on the taxes," he said. "I can read. I'm just making sure you understand." Sandra waited beside the locksmith. She wanted the exchange finished before Susan reconsidered or asked more questions. Todd noticed the flask through the plastic bag. "You're really taking that?" "Yes. I remember Dad carrying it when we were little. He wouldn't even let us drink from it. He carried water in it. He said we'd lose the cap." Todd shook his head. "I guess it means something to you. It belonged to my husband." Todd's expression changed slightly, but not enough. Susan got into the Subaru. She drove west through Twisp with the house keys still on her ring. At the edge of town, she pulled into a grocery store parking lot and removed them. The brass key to the front door had worn smooth along one side. She placed it in the cup holder and sat there until her breathing settled. Then she unfolded the county map. Wolf Creek Road climbed into the hills beyond the last tidy properties. The farther Susan drove, the deeper the snow lay beneath the trees. Mud pulled at the tires where afternoon sun had softened the road. Twice she stopped to move fallen branches. The turnoff was almost hidden by brush. She parked at the bottom and walked the final stretch. Her right knee complained on the incline. Cold air caught inside her chest. She kept going. The cabin appeared beyond a stand of cottonwoods, gray boards, sagging porch, rusted stovepipe. One corner of the roof had opened beneath a fallen limb. Snowmelt dripped through the gap and darkened the front wall. Susan stood outside with the papers under her arm. Behind her waited a suitcase, a few boxes, and Larry's ICU bag. Ahead stood the only property his family hadn't wanted. She stepped onto the porch. The boards held. The door was swollen shut, but the old lock still contained a keyhole. Susan reached into the envelope Todd had given her and found one iron key taped to the transfer papers. She pushed it into the lock, leaned her shoulder against the wood, and turned. The lock turned halfway and stopped. Susan worked it back and forth, feeling rust grind inside. On the 4th try, the bolt slid free. The door stayed where it was. She set the papers inside her coat and pushed with both hands. The swollen wood groaned against the frame. Something scraped across the floor on the other side. When the gap widened enough, cold, stale air came through, carrying the smell of mouse droppings, wet cedar, and old ashes. The scraping came from a wooden chair tipped beneath the latch. Susan reached through and shoved it away. Inside, the cabin was one main room with a narrow kitchen along the back wall. 2 small bedrooms opened from the right. The windows were cloudy, but unbroken. An iron stove stood on a sheet of stone near the center, its pipe leaning slightly where it entered the ceiling. Water had soaked a patch of floor beneath the damaged roof. One ceiling board sagged, the rest looked dry. Susan walked the perimeter before bringing in a single box. Larry had taught her that much during their years guiding. A shelter could look sound from the doorway and still have a cracked chimney, a rotten sill, or an animal living under the bed. She checked the floor with the heel of her boot. She opened cabinets with a broom handle she found behind the door. She looked beneath the 2 iron bed frames. A mouse ran across the kitchen counter and vanished behind the sink. "You were here first," Susan said. "I understand." The electricity didn't come on. She found an old breaker box inside the smaller bedroom, but several fuses were missing. The kitchen tap produced one hollow cough and nothing else. Outside, she located the well under a low wooden cover. The hand pump had been removed. A line ran from the well casing toward the cabin, but part of it lay exposed where the ground had washed away. The old outhouse still stood beyond the cottonwoods. Its door had fallen inward. Susan returned to the porch and sat on the top step. The sun had dropped behind the ridge. Cold settled quickly in the narrow valley. She could see her car below, packed with everything she had been allowed to keep. She took out her phone. Holly had sent 3 messages. The first asked whether Susan had arrived. The second offered the guest room again. The third said only, "Please answer me." Susan typed, "I arrived. I'm safe." She didn't mention the roof or the dry tap. She didn't want Holly reporting the condition to Todd. She didn't want Todd hearing that she had failed before she had decided what failure meant. There was one other person she could call. Gary answered after 2 rings. "Where are you?" "Wolf Creek." Silence held for a moment. "At the old place?" "Yes." "Inside?" "On the porch." "That's not what I asked." Susan looked at the dark doorway. The floor seemed solid. "How's the roof? Open in one corner. Power? No. Water? Also no." Gary muttered something she couldn't hear. "I can manage one night," she said. "No, you can't. I've slept in worse places." "So have I. That's why I know better. I have blankets. You have a wood stove nobody's inspected in 20 years, closer to 30. That isn't helping." Susan heard a cupboard open at his end. Then came the heavy sound of a toolbox being set down. "I'm coming up," he said. "It'll be dark. I own headlights. The road is mud. I own tires, too." "Gary?" "What?" She didn't know what she meant to say. "Don't come" felt dishonest. "Thank you" felt too small. "I haven't asked you for anything." "I know." He hung up. Susan carried the groceries inside before darkness covered the room. She brought in Larry's battery lantern from the car and set it on the kitchen counter. The beam revealed more mouse tracks, a stack of yellowed newspapers, and a row of empty canning jars. In the larger bedroom, the mattress had collapsed along one side. She dragged it onto the porch and discovered a nest beneath it, made from insulation and shredded seed sacks. She swept the floor. She wiped the bed frame with bottled water and laid flattened cardboard across the springs. Over that, she spread 2 camping pads, a blanket, and her sleeping bag. She was tightening the last corner when headlights moved between the trees. Gary came up the drive in an old red pickup. A blue tarp covered the bed. He climbed out wearing rubber boots and a canvas coat. He had brought tools, water, firewood, a camp stove, 2 fuel canisters, and a plastic tub of food. Susan looked into the truck bed. "Did you empty your whole garage?" "Not yet." He carried the first armful to the porch. She took the smaller water jug. "I can lift things." "I didn't say you couldn't." "You're acting like I called for a rescue. I'm acting like it's January." That settled the argument. Gary inspected the stove with a flashlight. He removed 2 handfuls of old nesting material from the firebox, then disconnected the pipe one section at a time. Soot fell onto the stone. Susan held the light while he worked. "Don't stand under that," he said. "I'm beside it. You're close enough to become under it." She moved 1 step. The upper pipe had rusted through near the ceiling collar. Gary pushed a screwdriver against the metal, and the tip went straight through. "If you'd lit this, smoke would have filled the room. I was going to inspect it. I know." He said it without doubt. Larry had trusted Susan's judgment even when his children mistook quietness for uncertainty. Gary understood the same thing. He went out to his truck and returned with a short length of stovepipe. "You carry that around?" Susan asked. "I took it off the shop stove last month. Never threw it away. You never throw anything away. That's why I have a stovepipe and you don't." They replaced the damaged section and checked the draft with a twist of burning newspaper. Smoke pulled upward. Gary built a small fire. He waited until the pipe warmed without leaking, then added 2 pieces of dry fir. Heat began slowly. It came off the stove in a narrow circle at first, touching Susan's knees while the rest of the room stayed cold. She set the camp stove on the counter and warmed soup in a saucepan. Gary found 2 enamel bowls in a cabinet, washed them with water he had brought, then inspected each one for mouse damage as if mice had learned to bite metal. They ate at the old table. "Did Todd know you were coming here?" Gary asked. "He gave me the property." Gary stopped with his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Gave?" "Transferred, along with the taxes. What happened to the Glover Street house?" "Todd gets it. The guiding business? Todd. The savings? Todd." Gary put down his spoon. Susan kept eating. She had learned in the hospital that if she stopped every time someone reacted to bad news, she would never finish a meal. "What did Larry's will say?" he asked. "It said everything went to Todd and Holly." "Everything?" "It was signed before Larry married me." Gary leaned back. The chair creaked beneath him. Larry knew that will was out of date. "Did he tell you he changed it?" "No." "Did you witness anything?" "No." "Then knowing isn't much use." Gary looked toward the fire. Larry had asked him twice over the years whether Susan would be protected if the worst happened. Gary had assumed the question meant insurance, or a later will, or the ordinary arrangements married people made. He had never asked for details. Now that seemed careless. "Holly went along with this?" he asked. "She didn't stop it. That's not what I asked. It's what happened." The room grew warmer. Snowmelt began dripping from Gary's boots onto the floor. Susan set down her spoon. "I'm staying here. Tonight, yes. Not only tonight." Gary watched her. "I have 60 days before the county can move this toward auction," she said. "I don't know yet how I'll pay the taxes. I don't know whether the well works. I don't know what the roof will cost. But I'm not giving Todd the satisfaction of watching me hand this back. Don't build your decision around Todd. I'm not. A minute ago, you were." Susan considered that. "All right," she said. "Then I'm staying because Larry asked me not to let it go." Gary's eyes lifted. "When?" "In the ICU. The last night." "What exactly did he say?" "Wolf Creek. Don't let it go." Gary rubbed one thumb across the handle of his spoon. Susan noticed. "What?" "Nothing. That wasn't nothing. He was sick. I know how sick he was. I mean, he might have been remembering the place. That's what I thought. And now I'm here." Gary got up and carried the bowls to the counter. He wasn't ready to tell Susan what had crossed his mind, because it rested on an old memory he couldn't place. Years earlier, Larry had asked him to make something in the machine shop. Gary could remember the smell of cutting oil and the bright curls of aluminum on the lathe. He couldn't remember why Larry had been so particular about the fit. The memory vanished before Gary could catch its shape. He opened the door and looked at the sky. "I'll sleep in the truck. There's another bed frame. There's no other mattress. There wasn't much of one in my room either. I've got a bench seat. You're 67. So was Larry. That's not an argument. It's the only one I've got." Susan gave him the spare sleeping bag. Gary took it without pretending he wouldn't use it. Before leaving, he placed a flashlight beside her bed and showed her where he had set a bucket of water. "If the wind changes, check the stovepipe. I know. If you smell smoke, wake me. I know. If the roof starts moving, I'll wake you." Gary stood in the bedroom doorway. "You don't have to prove anything tonight. I'm trying to sleep tonight. That too." After he went outside, Susan closed the door and listened to his boots cross the porch. The fire settled. A log shifted behind the stove door. She removed the house key from her pocket and placed it on the crate beside the bed. It was the first key she had held that day, which opened a place nobody could order her to leave. The thought didn't comfort her as much as she expected. Ownership on paper couldn't patch a roof. It couldn't bring water through a frozen line. It couldn't tell her why Larry had remembered Wolf Creek while dying. She slept in her clothes. At dawn, Gary knocked twice and came in carrying coffee. "I found your electrical problem," he said. Susan sat up. Her lower back had gone stiff. "You've been here all night. How did you find anything?" "I woke early. You never slept. I slept enough." He handed her a metal cup. "The service line is disconnected at the pole. Looks deliberate, probably shut off years ago. We'll need the utility out here. And the well. Could be worse. The exposed section split. The pump house has power equipment, but without service, we can't test it." Susan took a drink. The coffee was stronger than Larry used to make it, and better than hospital coffee. Gary had also inspected the roof in daylight. The fallen limb had broken 3 boards and torn the old metal sheeting. The damage looked frightening from below, but it hadn't spread beyond the corner. "We can cover it today," he said. "Proper repair when the weather clears." I brought a tarp." "That's not an answer. It's the one you're getting." They spent the morning clearing the limb. Gary used a small chainsaw while Susan worked a rope from the ground, keeping the cut sections from sliding onto the porch. She could feel the strain along her shoulders, but her hands knew how to manage the line. When Gary climbed the ladder, Susan braced the feet in the frozen soil. "Your left side is sinking," she called. "It's fine." It moved. Gary came down, and they reset the ladder on flat boards. "Larry would have let me climb," Susan said. "Larry once tied into a dead tree because he didn't want to walk 20 yards for a better anchor. He said that tree was sound. That tree fell the next spring. They stretched the tarp beneath the remaining metal and fastened it with screws and wooden strips. It wasn't attractive, but when light snow began near noon, nothing came through. That changed the cabin. The air inside no longer felt borrowed from the weather. Susan swept out the second bedroom while Gary worked on the well line. She found old wool blankets, a broken lantern, and a cardboard carton full of Forest Service maps. Most were stained. Some had Larry's notes in pencil along the margins. She resisted the urge to sit and read them. There was work in front of her. At the back of a kitchen cabinet, she found a tin cash box. The latch was unlocked. Inside were receipts for nails, lamp oil, canned peaches, and property taxes paid by Larry's father. The newest receipt came from the year he died. Susan spread the papers on the table. None helped with the current bill, but she put them in a dry grocery bag. Gary came inside carrying a length of cracked pipe. "Found it," he said. "There may be more." "Can you replace that section?" "Yes. Testing the pump is the question. The utility said someone can come tomorrow afternoon. You called already?" "At 8. Gary smiled slightly. "Good." Susan looked around the room. One corner was clean. The table held sorted documents. Water heated on the camp stove. Through the window, the tarp stayed tight across the roof. It wasn't a home yet. It had become a place where the next task could be done. After lunch, they drove into Twisp in Gary's truck. Susan went first to the county treasurer's office. The woman behind the counter printed the account history. Larry had paid irregularly during the last years, sometimes covering one installment and missing the next. Penalties had accumulated after his hospitalization. Susan read every line. "If I pay part today, does that stop the deadline?" she asked. "No, the full delinquent amount has to be resolved. Can I set up a plan? Not once the final notice has been issued." Susan asked for the exact date and wrote it on the front of the envelope. Then she asked the woman to stamp a copy of the transfer document showing when she had received it. Todd had said 60 days as if time were a favor he had included. The county calendar gave her 56. She didn't have the full amount. She did have a date, a balance, and proof that the parcel had passed to her. That was more useful than panic. At the utility office, she signed for temporary service in her own name. The deposit took nearly a quarter of what remained in her checking account. Gary waited without offering to pay it. Susan appreciated him for that. On the way back, they stopped at the Glover Street house. The new key didn't fit. Susan had known the locks would be changed. Still, the refusal of the lock struck her physically. Sandra opened the door after Susan knocked. She wore Susan's blue kitchen apron over her clothes. For a second, neither woman spoke. "I came for the remaining food and Larry's tools," Susan said. "The tools are estate property. The ones in the shed may be. There's a small toolbox in the hall closet. My name is written beneath the lid." Sandra kept one hand on the door. "Todd isn't here. I'm asking you. I don't know what's in the closet. Then we can look." Sandra hesitated, then let her enter. The house already smelled different. Furniture had been moved. Larry's recliner was gone. Blue tape still marked several pieces, but the estate dealer had placed small numbered stickers beside it. Susan took the toolbox, canned food, a winter coat, and a box of personal papers. On the kitchen counter, she saw the clear ICU bag. She had thought she'd packed it. Larry's watch and glasses were still inside. So was the field flask. Sandra followed her gaze. "You can take that," she said. "Todd said none of it matters." Susan picked up the bag. The flask knocked against the counter with an odd, heavy sound. She paused. "What?" Sandra asked. "Nothing." On the drive back to Wolf Creek, Susan held the bag on her lap. The flask seemed heavier than she remembered, but grief had distorted the weight of everything that week. That evening, after Gary left for home, the power came on. Only one lamp worked. It stood on the table beneath a shade browned by age. Susan switched it on and watched warm light reach the ceiling. She unpacked Larry's glasses and watch. The flask had dried hospital tape around its neck. She filled a basin with hot water and began cleaning it. Rust-colored dirt lifted from the dents. The cap turned smoothly. The canvas strap smelled faintly of damp earth, even after all those years in a cupboard. When Susan set the flask upright, it rocked. She checked the table. The table was level. She turned the flask over. The base sat crooked by less than the width of a fingernail. Around its edge ran a clean circular seam that didn't match the battered body. Susan dried it carefully. Then she carried it beneath the lamp, put on Larry's glasses over her own, and looked again. The seam had been machined. She took out her phone and called Gary. "Did you ever repair Larry's flask?" she asked. Gary didn't answer at once. "What part of it?" "The bottom." Another silence came through the line, longer this time. "Don't force it," he said. Susan rested one hand around the flask. "So, There is something to force. I'll come in the morning. You remembered. I remembered enough. Susan looked at the narrow seam circling the base. All right, she said. This time, I'll wait. Gary arrived at 7 with a rubber strap wrench, a jar of penetrating oil, and 2 breakfast sandwiches wrapped in foil. Susan had left the flask beneath the lamp all night. She hadn't touched it again. Gary took off his coat and sat at the table. He turned the flask over in his hands, running one thumb around the seam. You made that, Susan said. I did. When? 1999. Why? He asked me to. That isn't much of an answer. It's the only one I had then. Gary remembered more clearly with the object in his hands. Larry had come into the machine shed, carrying the flask and a sketch on the back of an equipment invoice. He wanted a shallow compartment built into the bottom. It had to close tightly, sit flat, and look like part of the original flask. Gary had been curious. What are you hiding, your lunch money? He'd asked. Something I don't want wet. Buy a plastic bag. I want this. Larry had stood beside the lathe while Gary worked. He'd checked the thread twice and asked for a wax seal around the inner lip. When Gary finished, Larry paid him with a set of new drill bits and made him promise not to discuss it. At the time, Gary thought his friend was hiding emergency cash or coordinates for one of his survey jobs. What did he put in it? Susan asked. I never saw. Did he ever mention it again? No. Not even after he got sick? Not to me. Gary set the flask upright. It leaned slightly because one thread had crossed when the base was last closed. He must have opened it at some point, he said. I fitted it better than that. Susan placed the breakfast sandwiches on 2 plates. Can you open it without damaging anything? That depends on how stubborn Larry was when he tightened it. He was usually very stubborn, I noticed. They ate before working. Gary insisted the metal should warm gradually. He placed the flask near the stove, not close enough to become hot, and let it sit while they drank coffee. Susan watched it more than she ate. Whatever lay inside had been there while she drove Larry to the hospital. It had sat beside his bed while doctors adjusted his medication. Todd had looked through the plastic bag and dismissed it. Susan tried not to turn that into meaning before she had facts. When the metal was warm, Gary put a drop of oil along the seam. He wrapped the flask body in a dish towel and fastened the strap wrench around the base. Hold here, he said. Susan braced the upper half between both hands. Gary applied slow pressure. Nothing moved. He stopped, adjusted the strap, then tried again. The metal gave a soft click. Susan felt it through her palms. Gary set the wrench aside and turned the base with his fingers. One full rotation exposed clean threads. Another released the waxed inner seal. The base came away. Inside the shallow compartment lay a folded packet wrapped in darkened wax paper. Susan didn't reach for it immediately. Gary placed the false bottom on the table. That's all I built, he said. She lifted the packet. It was heavier at one end. The wax paper crackled as she unfolded it. A brass key dropped into her palm. Stamped along the side were the words Box 114, First Security Bank, TWISP. Beneath the key was a sheet of paper folded into quarters. Susan recognized Larry's handwriting before she opened it. His capital letters always leaned forward. Susan, if you have this, then I didn't get the chance to put things right in person. Take the key to First Security. What it opens belongs with Wolf Creek and with you. Don't sign away the land or anything connected to it until you've seen what I left there. I should have explained sooner. I kept thinking there would be time. Susan read it twice. Gary stood near the stove. He gave her enough quiet to hear the fire settle. What does anything connected to it mean? She asked. I don't know. Did Larry own something else at Wolf Creek? Not that he told me. You worked with him for most of his life. That didn't mean he told me everything. Susan turned the key over. The bank's old name remained on the stamp. First Security had changed owners years earlier, though people in TWISP still called the branch by its former name. Larry's letter had no date. Gary examined the wax paper. This looks old. It could have been put in there when you made the base. Could have, before his heart disease. Yes, before any of this. Gary nodded. That was the first part Susan couldn't fit. Larry hadn't hidden the key during confusion at the end of his life. He had built a place for it nearly 3 decades earlier. Whatever he meant to protect had existed long before Todd's business failed, long before the ICU. and long before Susan imagined she might need protection from Larry's children. She folded the letter along its original creases. "We're going to the bank." Gary looked toward the window. Snow was falling steadily. "The road will be worse by noon. Then we'll leave now." They put the key, letter, and wax paper into Susan's purse. She carried the flask separately, wrapped in a towel. The utility worker arrived as they were preparing to leave. He checked the service line, replaced an exterior connector, and tested the panel. 2 bedroom outlets had faulty wiring, but the kitchen circuit and main room were safe. Gary stayed with him while Susan called a plumber about the well pump. The first person she reached couldn't come for 10 days. The second agreed to look the following afternoon. Each appointment spent money she didn't have. Each one also made leaving less likely. By the time they reached Twisp, the snow had become rain. The bank occupied a brick building near the highway. Inside, a heater blew too strongly over a rack of deposit slips. Susan waited while a teller directed her to a desk along the back wall. A branch officer named Elaine Turner came to meet them. She had known Larry by sight and remembered Susan from years of ordinary errands. "I was sorry to hear about him," she said. "Thank you." Susan showed her the key but kept the letter inside her purse. "I need to open this box." Elaine examined the stamped number. "This is one of our older keys. It was Larry's." "I'll check the record." She went through a locked door and returned several minutes later with a folder. Her expression had changed from sympathy to caution. "The box is active, but I can't take you into the vault today." "Why not?" "The signature card is old, and the way the rental was established isn't clear in our current system. My husband rented it. I can't confirm the customer information until we verify your authority. I have his death certificate. That may not be enough." Susan felt Gary shift behind her. "What would be enough?" she asked. Elaine turned the folder so only she could see it. If the box was solely in his name, the executor or a court-authorized representative would usually need to be present for an inventory. If it was rented under another legal arrangement, we'd need documents showing who has authority under that arrangement. "What other arrangement?" "I'm not allowed to disclose the registration to someone who hasn't established access." Susan stared at the brass key. "Larry left this for me. I believe you." "No, you believe I'm holding it. That's not the same thing." Elaine lowered her voice. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I have to follow the record. Does Todd have access? I can't discuss another customer. Has he been here? I can't tell you that either." Gary stepped closer to the desk. "Is the box in danger of being drilled?" Elaine looked at him. "Not on the information I have." Susan caught the careful wording. What information would change that? A court order, an estate request, unpaid rent after notice. Several things. Is the rent current? Elaine checked the folder again. "It's paid through the end of the year." Susan hadn't paid it. She had never seen a charge for it on their checking account. Larry had kept some small account or payment method separate from the household finances. That wasn't impossible. He had handled old guiding receipts and occasional Forest Service consulting work long after his health began failing. Still, Susan had managed nearly every bill for 6 years. She knew what came into the house. "Can I put a hold on the box?" she asked. "Not without proving authority. Can Todd?" "I can't advise you about that." Susan returned the key to her purse. "What kind of lawyer handles this? Probate, business records, or property title?" "Possibly all 3. Gary spoke before Susan could. "Peter Castro." Elaine nodded. He would understand the title side. Peter's office stood above a pharmacy 2 blocks away. There was no guarantee he could see them, but Susan wasn't willing to drive back to Wolf Creek carrying an unanswered key. The receptionist found 20 minutes between appointments. Peter Castro wore shirt sleeves and a dark tie loosened at the collar. His office contained more survey maps than Susan expected from an attorney. Rolled plats stood in a basket beside the window. He read Larry's letter without interrupting. Then he examined the key and looked at a photocopy of the old will Susan had kept. "Did you sign anything releasing claims against the estate?" he asked. "No. Did Todd ask you to?" "He had the Wolf Creek property transferred to me. That document may have its own language. I'll need to read it." Susan handed him the envelope from the county office. Peter read the transfer twice. "This conveys whatever interest the estate held in the 40-acre parcel. It also assigns the delinquent taxes to you." "I know that part. It doesn't say you release anything else. Should it?" "Not for a simple transfer?" Gary leaned forward. "Can she open the box?" "Maybe. First, I need to know how it's registered." "The bank won't say." They may respond to a formal request if Susan provides proof of marriage, death, and possession of the original key. If the registration involves a business, we may have to locate the state filing or county records. Susan looked at Larry's letter on Peter's desk. What if Todd goes to the bank first? If the box isn't a state property, his appointment as executor won't help him. If it is a state property, he could request an inventory. He doesn't know it exists. Keep it that way for now. Susan glanced toward Gary. Peter noticed. Who else knows about the key? Only Gary. And the letter? Only us. Make copies. Keep the original somewhere secure, but not inside an empty cabin. It isn't empty. Peter's face softened slightly. A cabin with a damaged roof then. It's covered. Gary cleared his throat. Mostly. Peter returned the papers. I'll request the bank record and search filings connected to Larry's name, Wolf Creek, and the parcel description. Don't expect an answer today. What will it cost? He named an initial fee. Susan looked down at her hands. After the utility deposit and supplies, paying him would leave very little for the well or taxes. Peter understood the calculation. I can limit the first search, he said. 2 hours. If it leads nowhere, we stop. And if it leads somewhere, then you decide what the answer is worth. Susan took out her checkbook. Her phone rang before she finished writing. Todd's name appeared on the screen. She let it ring once more, then answered. I'm with someone. What do you need? You went back into the house yesterday. Sandra let me collect my things. She said you took papers. My papers? What papers? Medical records, receipts, personal correspondence. Todd was in the office of his construction company, watching an overdue notice print from the machine beside his desk. Sandra had told him about the flask, the toolbox, and the box of documents. The flask meant nothing to him. Papers were different. Papers could delay probate. Mercer has a receipt and release for you, he said. It confirms you took your personal property and accepted Wolf Creek. I'll have someone review it. Review what? It's a receipt. Then waiting won't hurt it. Todd's voice sharpened. Susan, you need to cooperate. I packed my life in 6 days. I'm cooperating. The estate can't stay open while everybody decides what they might want. Your father has been dead less than 2 weeks. That doesn't change what has to be done. Susan looked at Peter. He held out one hand, asking silently for the phone. She switched to speaker and placed it on the desk. Todd continued. Mercer needs your signature by tomorrow. Peter spoke. She won't be signing tomorrow. The line went quiet. Who is that? Todd asked. Peter Castro. I'm reviewing Mrs. Hardy's property and estate documents. Todd knew the name. Anyone who dealt with land in Okanagan County did. What property documents? The ones she already has. If Mr. Mercer wants her signature, he can send the release to my office. This is a family estate. It's also a legal estate. I wasn't talking to you. No, Peter said. You were pressing an unrepresented widow to sign on a deadline you created. Susan watched rain trail down the office window. She hadn't asked Peter to defend her. She also didn't stop him. Todd drew a breath. I'll have Mercer send it. He ended the call. Peter handed the phone back. Now he knows you have counsel, he said. I only paid you for 2 hours. For the next 2 hours, you have counsel. Gary almost smiled. Peter's receptionist knocked and passed him a fax that had arrived from Mercer's office. Todd must have called immediately. Peter scanned the release. His expression tightened. This isn't only a receipt. He turned the paper toward Susan. Most of the language meant little to her. One paragraph was underlined. What does it do? She asked. You'd confirm the Wolf Creek transfer as full satisfaction of any claim against Larry's estate. You would also release claims involving business interests, real property, accounts, and personal effects, whether known or unknown. Unknown, that word matters. Susan placed Larry's brass key beside the paper. Todd didn't know what it opened, neither did she. But someone wanted her signature before she found out. Peter folded the release and placed it in a separate file. Don't answer Todd tonight, he said. I'll respond to Mercer. What will you tell him? That you declined to sign? Will that stop the estate? No. It stops you from giving up rights you haven't identified. Susan put the key back in her purse. Peter made copies of Larry's letter and the transfer papers. He gave the originals to Susan in a large envelope and wrote his office number across the front. I'll call the bank's legal department, he said. They may have an archived rental agreement that isn't visible at the branch. How long? A few days if they cooperate? Susan looked at the check she had written him. You said 2 hours. I'm still inside the first one. Gary drove her back to Wolf Creek. The rain had softened the road, and the pickup slid sideways near the final turn. He corrected without speaking. At the cabin, water dripped from the edge of the tarp instead of through the ceiling. Susan stood beneath the dry patch and listened to the rain strike overhead. She had expected the place to feel smaller after Peter's office. Instead, it felt unfinished. Gary set the flask on the shelf above the table. "You should keep that letter somewhere else," he said. "Where?" "The bank." "The bank won't let me into the bank." "Peter's office, then. I'll take it tomorrow." She placed the original in a sealed food container inside her suitcase for the night. The brass key stayed in the zipped pocket of her coat. The plumber arrived the next afternoon. His name was Ron Keller, and he had worked on several wells along Wolf Creek Road. He crouched beside the casing, removed the pump cover, and tested the wiring with a meter. "The motor might still run," he said. "The line won't hold pressure until we replace the split section." "How deep is the well?" Ron wiped mud from the old identification plate. "Looks like 110 feet. That's better than some up here. Is the water good?" "Can't tell you until we pull a sample." He gave Susan 2 prices, one for a temporary repair and one for replacing the exposed line properly. She chose the proper repair. Gary looked at her after Ron left. "You could have done temporary. I'm not living temporarily." That was the first time Susan said it aloud, without Todd anywhere in her thoughts. They spent the afternoon clearing brush from the cabin wall. Blackberry canes had climbed over a broken rain barrel and rooted beneath the siding. Susan cut them close to the ground while Gary pulled the thicker runners with a mattock. Behind the brush, they found a narrow cellar door. The hinges had rusted solid. Gary sprayed them with oil and worked them loose. Cold earth breathed through the opening. The cellar held shelves of empty jars, 2 rotten potato crates, and a galvanized tub. No hidden papers waited there. No second key. It was only a cellar. Susan was almost relieved. She had begun looking at every seam as though Larry might have left his life folded behind it. On the 3rd morning, Peter called while she was scraping loose paint from the window frame. "The bank found the original contract," he said. Susan set down the scraper. "And Larry named you as successor renter. It was permitted under the bank's policy at the time. On proof of his death, the contract gives you access. He did that without telling me? He signed the designation. You didn't need to sign unless you accessed the box while he was alive. Why couldn't the branch see it? The contract was on microfilm. Their current system only showed the box number and a restricted account code." Susan sat on the porch step. "When can I open it?" "Tomorrow morning. The bank wants me present because of the age of the record. Bring identification and a certified death certificate." "Will Todd be notified?" "Not by the bank. You're accessing it under the rental agreement, not as executor." Peter paused. "One other thing. Mercer sent a revised release. Is it better? It removes the words known or unknown. I still don't recommend signing anything until we see the box." "Then I won't." She heard papers move on Peter's desk. "That's a complete sentence, Susan." "I know. The well pump came on that afternoon." Ron replaced the damaged pipe, repaired one connection beneath the cabin, and switched the system on. The pump shuddered for several seconds. Brown water coughed from the kitchen tap, followed by air, then a steady rusty stream. They let it run through a hose outside. By evening, the water cleared. Ron filled a sample bottle for testing and warned Susan not to drink from the tap until the laboratory results came back. She washed her hands anyway. The water was cold enough to hurt. Gary stood in the kitchen doorway. "You're smiling," he said. "It's water. I know what it is. Then you know why." Susan heated a kettle and washed every dish in the cupboard. She scrubbed the sink, wiped the counter, and cleaned mud from the floor. It was ordinary work, which made it easier than thinking about the next morning. The bank opened at 9. Susan arrived with Peter. Gary waited outside in his truck after deciding that 3 people entering together would make the visit look more dramatic than it was. Elaine met them at the vault desk. She checked Susan's identification, copied the death certificate, and placed the old rental agreement beside a current access form. Susan saw her own name on the faded copy. Susan E. Hardy, successor upon death. Larry had signed beneath it in 1999. The same year Gary built the false bottom. "Please sign here," Elaine said. Susan signed. Elaine compared the signature with Susan's identification, then unlocked the gate leading to the vault. Rows of narrow metal doors covered 2 walls. Box 114 sat near the bottom. Elaine inserted a bank key. Susan used the brass key beside it. Both turned. The metal drawer slid outward with a quiet scrape. It was heavier than Susan expected. Elaine carried it to a private viewing room and set it on the table. "Press the call button when you're finished," she said. She closed the door. Susan sat down. Peter remained standing until she lifted the lid. Inside were 2 thick envelopes, a rolled document tied with cotton string, and a small black ledger. A photograph lay on top. It showed the Wolf Creek cabin in summer. The roof was straight, the porch newly painted, and Larry stood beside the well with his father. Larry looked to be in his 30s. His father held a survey rod upright against one shoulder. On the back, Larry had written, "The line was never where they said it was." Susan handed the photograph to Peter. "What line? We'll find out." The first envelope bore her name. Inside was another letter, longer than the one hidden in the flask. Susan read the first paragraph silently. "Susie, the Wolf Creek 40 is only the old homestead piece. In 1998, I bought the adjoining inholding through Hardy Land and Timber. I kept it separate because of problems left from my first marriage and because I wanted one thing nobody could sell out from under you. The company papers name you after me. The deed and water record are in this box. Get someone who understands title before you agree to anything." Her hands stopped. Peter waited. Susan read the paragraph again, then passed him the letter. "What is Hardy Land and Timber? An LLC from the wording. I've never heard of it. He appears to have formed a limited liability company to hold property. How much property?" Peter opened the second envelope. The top document was an operating agreement for Hardy Land Timber LLC. Larry was named as the initial and sole member. Several pages described management, expenses, transfer restrictions, and what happened at his death. Peter turned to the final section. A typed sentence named Susan Elaine Hardy as sole successor member. Larry's signature had been notarized in the autumn of 1998. Beneath the operating agreement lay formation papers bearing a state filing stamp. Peter read the dates before saying anything. These appear consistent. Consistent with what? With an LLC created after you married Larry. Susan touched the edge of the document. "Do I own it? If the company still exists, if the agreement remained in effect, and if Larry didn't transfer his interest later, this says you succeed him. That's a lot of ifs." "It is. We check them." He untied the rolled document. The paper resisted flattening. Peter used the ledger and 2 envelopes to hold down the corners. It was a statutory warranty deed recorded with Okanagan County in 1998. The legal description ran for several lines Susan couldn't follow. A handwritten notation near the top stated 120 acres, more or less. The grantee was Hardy Land Timber, LLC. Susan looked at Peter. 120? Adjoining the homestead, according to Larry's letter. Then Todd didn't give me 40 acres. He transferred the estate's interest in 40. This deed suggests a separate company owns another 120. Does the company land touch mine? We need the recorded map. Peter opened the black ledger. The first pages listed payments for filing fees, title work, taxes, and road maintenance. Later entries grew less frequent. Lori Henderson's name appeared beside several totals with the initials L.H. Susan recognized the first name, though she hadn't seen Lori in years. Lori had kept books for some of Larry's guiding work during the late 90s. Susan had assumed that was all. A final envelope contained tax receipts and a brittle certificate backed with linen. Across the top were the words, Certificate of Water Right. The original priority date was in the spring of 1901. Susan read the point of diversion, place of use, and quantity. She understood almost none of it. She knew only that Wolf Creek appeared several times and that the legal description included sections matching the deed. "Is that still valid?" she asked. Peter handled the certificate by its edges. "I can't tell from this alone. Water rights can be changed, divided, abandoned, or challenged. This is old enough to matter if it stayed active. How much does it matter? In this valley, sometimes more than the dirt." Susan looked at the photograph again. Larry and his father stood in green grass that reached almost to their knees. Behind them, Wolf Creek caught the sun between the cottonwoods. The place didn't look swampy. It looked watered. Peter copied every document with a portable scanner. He placed each page back in order and asked Susan to leave the originals in the box until he had certified copies and secure storage. She kept Larry's second letter and the photograph. At the vault desk, Elaine updated the rental record in Susan's name. The annual payment had been coming from a small account opened by Larry at the same bank. Its balance was less than a few $100s, enough to cover the box and nothing else. That answered one question without touching the larger ones. Outside, Gary watched Susan cross the parking lot. "Well?" he asked. She got into the truck and closed the door. Larry bought another 120 acres. Gary's hands remained on the steering wheel. Where? Beside the cabin. Through a company he formed. What company? Hardy Land and Timber. Gary turned toward her. Recognition moved across his face. Then uncertainty. "I remember that name." "You do?" "On survey stakes, maybe invoices. I thought it was one of the guiding names Larry tried. He named me to take it after he died." Gary looked through the windshield toward the bank. Susan placed the photograph between them. "What does the writing mean?" he asked. "I don't know yet." Gary studied Larry's father holding the survey rod. Peter came out carrying his case. "I'm going to the county records office," he said through the open window. "I need to confirm the deed chain and pull the parcel map." "We'll come," Susan said. At the records counter, Peter ordered certified copies of the 1998 deed. It appeared in the index under Hardy Land Timber LLC, exactly where the box document said it would. The clerk brought out the parcel map. Peter laid it flat. The original 40-acre homestead formed a rough rectangle along Wolf Creek. The separate 120 acres curved around its north and west sides. A narrow strip reached the county road. The cabin parcel wasn't landlocked at all when both properties were treated together. The stream crossed the larger parcel before entering the 40. Susan followed the blue line with one finger. "All of this touches?" "Yes," Peter said. "The two parcels make one connected block, 160 acres. According to these records, what happens now?" "I confirm the company's status, trace the taxes, and examine the water record. Then we establish your succession in a form the county can recognize. Will that become public?" "The deed already is. Your connection to the LLC will become easier to find once we record the succession documents." Susan thought of Todd's release. He had wanted her to accept 40 delinquent acres and sign away every unknown business interest. He hadn't known the name Hardy Land Timber. His contempt had simply made the risk invisible to him. Larry had seen a different risk nearly 3 decades earlier. Susan looked down at the two parcels joined around Wolf Creek. The family hadn't discarded the whole property. They had discarded the only person who could put it back together. Peter recorded the succession notice 2 days later. He called Susan first. "Once this enters the index, anyone searching Larry's name or the Wolf Creek deed may find it," he said. "Is there a reason to wait?" "Only if you want more time before the family reacts. Waiting won't make the papers stronger." "No, then record them." The notice didn't settle ownership by itself. It placed Susan's claim in the county record and connected her name to the LLC. Peter still had to verify the company history and the water right. By then, the well water had passed its laboratory test. Susan drank the first glass standing at the kitchen sink. It tasted faintly of iron and very cold earth. Gary tried it after her. "Needs a filter," he said. "It needs a cup that isn't metal." That too. They installed temporary insulation around the exposed line. Gary repaired the porch step that had split beneath Susan's boot. Susan cleaned the larger bedroom and unpacked enough clothes to stop living from her suitcase. She left the rest folded inside. The county notice appeared online on Monday. Holly arrived at Wolf Creek on Tuesday afternoon. She parked below the muddy rise and walked up, carrying a cardboard tray with 2 coffees. Her boots weren't made for the road. Mud covered them before she reached the porch. Susan was replacing a torn window screen at the table. "I didn't know if you had coffee up here," Holly said. "I do?" Holly set down the tray. "This is better than mine anyway." Susan waited. Holly took off her coat and looked around the cabin. The clean floor, lit stove, and stacked firewood seemed to unsettle her. She had expected damage. She had also expected Susan to look defeated by it. "It's warmer than I remember," Holly said. "You came here before?" "Dad brought Todd and me once after Grandpa died. Todd said there were snakes in the cellar, so I wouldn't go near it. There are jars." "No snakes? Not so far." Holly sat at the table. Todd knows about the company. I assumed he would. Mercer saw the filing. He called Todd yesterday. What did Todd say? Mostly that it should belong to the estate. What do you say? Holly turned the coffee cup between her hands. I don't know what the law says. That wasn't the question. No. Holly looked toward the shelf. Larry's flask stood above it, clean now, except for the dents. The base had been screwed on loosely. Was it in there? She asked. Susan didn't pretend not to understand. The first clue was. So Todd was right. You took papers from the house. The key was inside the flask. Todd gave it to me at the hospital, called it junk, and watched me take it. I know. Sandra told him she saw the flask when you came back. Did Sandra also tell him I took my medical records? She did. And did that become suspicious too? Holly closed her eyes briefly. No. Susan lifted the screen frame and tested the new mesh with one finger. Why are you here? To tell you what's happening before Todd does. Then tell me. Holly removed the lid from her coffee and put it back on without drinking. Todd's company has been in trouble since last summer. Worse than I told you. How much worse? He used a construction loan for those 2 houses. When the first buyer pulled out, he borrowed against equipment to keep working. Then the supplier stopped his account. Susan remembered the payroll shortage Larry had covered. Your father gave him money. I found out after we talked. Did Todd tell you? No. Sandra did. She thought I already knew. How much does he owe? More than the company can pay. The construction loan is over $300,000. The supplier and equipment notes add nearly $200,000 more. Some of it's secured by the business. Some has Todd's personal guarantee. Susan set down the screen. So, he loses the company, and possibly their house. That explains why he wants money. It doesn't explain why I had 6 days. Holly's fingers tightened around the cup. The lender gave him until the end of February to bring the construction loan current or show enough assets for an extension. Larry had died in January. The funeral, the will meeting, the locksmith, and the estate dealer had all taken place inside a timetable Susan hadn't known existed. Sandra calculated what the Glover Street house could sell for, Holly said. She added the savings and the guiding equipment. She thought it would be enough to negotiate with the bank. She calculated it before the funeral. Holly looked down. When? While Dad was in the hospital. Susan didn't move. Holly rushed to fill the silence. She didn't know he would die. Not exactly. The doctors had already talked to Todd about how serious it was. They talked to all of us. I know. Sandra called an estate dealer while Larry was alive. She asked for information. She says she didn't schedule anything then. Susan looked at the window screen between her hands. The mesh was pulled unevenly at one corner. She removed 2 staples and began again. Holly watched her. Todd told me Dad had always intended him to have the guiding business, she said. He said the old will proved it. He said you had your own savings and Social Security. My savings paid household bills when Larry stopped working. I didn't know that. You didn't ask? No. And the 40 acres? Todd wanted it off the estate inventory because of the taxes. Sandra said transferring it to you solved 2 problems. You'd have somewhere to go, and the estate wouldn't have to clear the delinquency. There it is. What? The favor. Holly's eyes filled, but Susan didn't rescue her from the moment. Todd told me the release was routine, Holly said. He said everyone signed one. Did you? Yes. What did yours release? My interest in some of the equipment and the business. Todd said he needed clear control to sell quickly. Did he pay you? No. Did he promise to? He said if anything remained after the debts. Susan sat across from her. Holly, your father's estate is not Todd's construction company. I know that now. You knew it then. Holly pressed both hands against the warm cup. I knew it didn't feel right. That isn't the same as stopping him. No, it isn't. Outside, a truck engine sounded below the rise. Holly turned toward the window. Todd's pickup came into view, followed by Sandra's car. You told them you were here, Susan said. I told Todd I was coming. That's not the same thing. He said he wanted to talk. Susan stood. You could have warned me. I just did. You warned me when they were already on the road. Todd reached the porch first. He didn't knock. Susan had left the door open while working on the screen, and he stepped inside. Sandra followed, carrying a leather folder. Todd looked at Holly. You beat us here. Holly didn't answer. His gaze moved over the cabin, pausing at the repaired stovepipe and the electric lamp. Then he noticed the field flask. So, that's how you found it. Susan stood between him and the shelf. You need to go back outside and knock. Todd gave a disbelieving laugh. Seriously? Yes? We need to talk about Dad's property. You still need to knock. Sandra touched his arm. Todd, just do it. He stared at Susan, then stepped backward onto the porch. Sandra went with him. Susan closed the door. 3 seconds later, Todd knocked. She opened it, but didn't invite them in. What do you want? Sandra held up the folder. We want to avoid a legal mess, then stop creating one. The LLC belonged to Larry, Todd said. That makes it part of his estate. Peter says it isn't that simple. Peter works for you. Yes. Todd glanced past her toward Holly. You told her about the loans. She needed to know. That was private. You made it relevant when you used Dad's estate to cover them. I'm trying to keep people employed. Sandra stepped forward. There are crews depending on the company, vendors, families. This isn't only about us. Susan looked at her. Did those families change my locks? Sandra's face hardened. We offered you this property. You offered 40 acres with delinquent taxes. You didn't know the other property existed. Neither did you. That's true. So nobody deceived you. Todd tried to make me sign away unknown business interests. It was a standard release, Todd said. Mercer drafted it. Then why did you need it the next day? Because probate costs money every week it stays open. No. You needed the Glover house listed before your lender's deadline. Holly stood behind Susan now. She still looked frightened, but she didn't move away. Todd saw her position. You don't understand the business, he said to Susan. I understand a deadline. I spent 15 years building my company, and Larry spent 6 years dying. That's not fair. Susan's voice remained level. No, it isn't. Sandra opened the folder. We're prepared to cover the Wolf Creek taxes and repay your utility expenses. In return, you transfer any LLC interest to the estate, subject to a proper valuation. You still think it belongs to the estate. We think a court may decide it does. What do you think it's worth? Sandra glanced at Todd. That pause told Susan they had already asked someone. Todd answered, We don't know. Then why offer money before a valuation? Because you can't afford a title fight. He regretted the words as soon as he said them. Susan saw that too. The offer wasn't kindness. It was another clock. They believed the cost of defending herself would force her to surrender before anyone established what the land held. Susan folded her arms. I'll discuss documents through Peter. This is family, Todd said. You used that word at the bank office too, through a release. I never knew about the bank. I believe you. Her certainty unsettled him more than an accusation would have. Susan continued. You didn't know what Larry left. You only knew I had less money, less time, and nowhere else to go. You thought that was enough. Todd looked toward the muddy yard. For the first time, he stopped trying to soften it. If I don't bring the lender something by the end of next month, I lose the construction company. Sandra and I could lose the house. Dad's property can prevent that. Larry's property, Susan said, not mine. Todd met her eyes. All of it. There was the complete shape of it. Todd wasn't protecting family history or carrying out a promise. He needed every asset within reach because his own choices had narrowed to one deadline. Sandra had counted the estate before Larry died. Todd had pushed the will because it gave him control. Holly's hesitation had been useful. Susan's grief had been useful. And the worthless 40 had been useful until it stopped being worthless. Susan held the door. Peter will answer your attorney. Sandra's mouth tightened. You may wish you'd taken our offer. Then I'll wish it from my own porch. Todd turned away first. Sandra followed him down the steps. Holly stayed inside. When the vehicles had gone, Susan returned to the table and finished stretching the screen. Her phone rang before she placed the final staple. The caller introduced herself as Lori Henderson. I saw the Hardy Land and Timber filing, Lori said. I kept those books when Larry formed it. Susan looked at Larry's flask on the shelf. There are things you need to know about why he did that, Lori said. Things Todd was never told. Can you come to Wolf Creek? Susan asked. I can come tomorrow. Bring anything you still have. Lori arrived before noon in a small sedan with a banker's box strapped into the passenger seat. She was 70, with short white hair and a careful way of placing her feet on the muddy ground. Gary carried the box up the rise. I'm old, not empty-handed, Lori told him. I know. I'm keeping you from falling. You first. Inside, Susan made coffee while Lori removed 3 binders from the box. Each was labeled in neat block letters. I heard Larry had died, Lori said. I didn't hear what Todd did until the filing appeared. How did you see it? My niece works for a title company. Hardy Land and Timber came through an update search. She knew I'd kept the books. Lori opened the oldest binder. I worked for Larry from 1997 through 2001, guiding receipts, payroll, equipment. Then he formed this company. Why didn't I know? He didn't run it from your household. There wasn't much to run. One land purchase, taxes, maintenance, and the water records. Susan placed Larry's second letter beside the binder. He said he wanted one thing nobody could sell out from under me. That's what he told me. Lori found a yellow copy of a closing statement. It listed the seller, purchase price, title charge, and legal description for the 120 acres. Larry had looked at that inholding for years, she said. His father believed it belonged with the homestead, but the title split long before either of them owned it. When the owner agreed to sell, Larry moved quickly. With what money? His own savings and a Forest Service retirement payout. This was after his divorce from Carol. He was very particular about that. He didn't want questions about whose money bought it. Gary stood near the stove. Why the company? Separation. Larry said Todd already treated the Glover Street house and guiding business as if they were waiting for him. Holly wasn't as demanding, but she followed her brother. Larry worried that if anything happened to him, they'd push Susan aside before she understood what she was entitled to. Susan sat across from Lori. He worried about that in 1998. He worried about Todd's attitude, not this exact situation. Todd had been young then, but old enough to resent the woman his father married after the divorce. He had refused Susan's food at family dinners and asked Larry for money in private. None of it seemed large at the time. Why didn't Larry change the will? Susan asked. I told him to. What did he say? That the company agreement protected you and he'd handle the rest later. Lori closed the binder. Larry was careful about land and careless about time. The room went quiet. Susan looked toward the suitcase in the bedroom. She could blame Larry for that carelessness and still miss him. Both things fit inside the same day. Lori produced copies of annual reports, tax receipts, and bank statements. Her records ended after she stopped keeping the books, but every figure matched the early entries in the black ledger. I can sign a declaration, she said. I remember the formation, the closing, and what Larry told me. Would you say it in court? If I had to. Even against Todd? I wouldn't be speaking against Todd. I'd be speaking about Larry. Peter came to the cabin that afternoon. He compared Lori's records with the certified county deed and the documents from the box. The state archive had located every annual filing. Larry had maintained the LLC himself after Lori left. He had missed one report during his final hospitalization, but the company had not been dissolved. That can be corrected, Peter said. The late fee is small. Susan paid it from the last comfortable part of her checking account. Peter placed 4 documents in a row on the table. The state filing proved the company existed. The operating agreement named Susan as successor. The county deed proved the company owned the 120 acres. Lori's record showed the purchase wasn't mixed into the guiding business or Larry's first marriage. Taken together, these establish a strong ownership chain, he said. Strong isn't final. Nothing is final until nobody can challenge it. But these aren't loose papers anymore. They match independent public records. And the water? Peter opened a separate folder. He had traced the certificate through the state's water right files. The original right dated to 1901, when Larry's grandfather's generation had first put Wolf Creek water onto the homestead meadow. Later, filings extended the recognized place of use across the adjoining parcel after the 2 tracts came under common control. Can a water right sit unused that long? Susan asked. Usually, long non-use creates problems. This one wasn't simply abandoned. Larry filed the required statements, maintained the diversion, and documented seasonal irrigation of the lower meadow. Gary nodded. He opened that ditch most springs. I helped twice. You never told me, Susan said. You didn't ask where I went on those mornings. I thought you were fishing. We did some of that too. Peter showed her an agency abstract carrying the same certificate number as the document from the box. The state record lists the right as active, subject to confirmation of current use and quantity. I inspected the diversion yesterday. Water is still reaching the property through the old ditch. What does that give me? A senior claim. Older rights generally stand ahead of later ones during shortage. In the Methau Valley, that can carry substantial value. How substantial? I won't guess. A buyer or appraiser will. Lori signed her declaration before a notary in Peter's office the following morning. Gary signed a separate statement describing Larry's yearly maintenance of the ditch and the physical relationship between the parcels. Susan signed the overdue LLC report and a formal acceptance of successor membership. Peter notarized her signature, then handed her a certified membership record. "This is your authority to act for Hardy Land and Timber," he said. "Keep the original secure. Can Todd take it? He can challenge it. Taking it is different." Peter filed the updated company record with the state and recorded an affidavit connecting Susan's succession to the 1998 deed. The proof was no longer hidden in a Flask or safe deposit box. It now existed in matching files at the bank, the state, the county, and Peter's office. Susan stored certified copies in a locking metal case beneath the cabin floorboards. The originals remained in the bank box. She kept Larry's first letter in the pocket of her coat. 2 days later, an unfamiliar number appeared on her phone. "Mrs. Hardy, my name is Alan Matthews. I manage land acquisitions for Cascade Crest Resorts and Vineyards." Susan stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing paint from a brush. "How did you get my number?" "Your attorney's office forwarded my contact request." She looked toward Gary, who was repairing a cabinet hinge at the table. "What do you want?" "I'd like to discuss your Wolf Creek parcels and the water right." The words sounded different from a stranger. "Why?" "Our company has been evaluating land for a small vineyard and lodge project in the Methu Valley. Most available parcels don't have secure senior water. My land isn't for sale." "I understand. I'm asking for a meeting, not a commitment." Susan dried her hands. "What did you think you were buying before my filing appeared?" "Nothing. Our title search found the older deed after your succession record linked the parcels. Then our water consultant found the certificate." "You found it that quickly?" "We pay people to find water." Alan asked to meet at Peter's office. Susan agreed only after Peter confirmed that Cascade Crest was a real company and Alan worked for it. The meeting took place on Friday. Alan arrived with maps, recent comparable sales, and a written expression of interest. He was 47, dressed for an office but wearing boots clean enough to show he hadn't walked the property. He spread an aerial image across the conference table. "The value comes from the connected acreage, road access, and senior water position," he said. "The cabin itself isn't material to us. It is to me. I understand." "No, you understand it has little value on your sheet." Alan accepted that without argument. "Our preliminary estimate for an outright purchase is $1,850,000, subject to title review, water confirmation, environmental inspection, and county approvals." Susan read the amount twice. The 40 acres Todd had pushed onto her to avoid back taxes formed only the center of what Larry had protected. The larger parcel gave it road access. The water right made the whole block valuable to someone who needed certainty in a dry valley. "What would you do with the cabin?" she asked. "We'd probably remove it." Gary shifted in his chair. Susan closed the proposal. "Then, you're not buying the land." Alan didn't look surprised. "We could discuss reserving a home site." "No. Or a life estate around the cabin. I already own the cabin. I don't need permission to die in it." Peter looked down, hiding a brief smile. Alan gathered his papers slowly. "There may be another structure," he said, "a limited lease of water use, with strict terms, while you retain the land. I'd need approval to explore it. You can explore it. That isn't an agreement." "Understood." He left the written estimate with Peter. After Alan had gone, Susan sat without speaking. $1,850,000 was outside the scale of anything she had expected. It could pay the taxes, rebuild the cabin, and secure the rest of her life. It could also disappear into Todd's debts if his claim succeeded. Peter slid the proposal into her file. "Don't show this to anyone yet," he said. "I wasn't planning to. The title work supports you. The offer establishes why someone may fight harder now." Susan placed her certified LLC record beside Alan's letter. The Flask had carried her to a door Larry meant only for her. What waited behind it was no longer a private promise. It was ownership somebody else could measure. Todd measured it within 4 days. His attorney sent Peter a formal demand, claiming that Larry's membership in Hardy Land Timber belonged to the estate. The letter ordered Susan to stop acting for the company, stop discussing the property with buyers, and turn over every document from the safe deposit box. Peter read the demand at the cabin table. "They've moved beyond asking," he said. "Can they order me to do those things?" "No. A letter from an attorney isn't a court order. What happens if I ignore it? They file something. Todd filed the next morning. He asked the probate court to declare the LLC interest an estate asset. He also asked for a temporary restriction, preventing Susan from selling, leasing, transferring, or borrowing against the land or water right. Attached to the filing was the old will, the estate inventory, and a statement Todd had signed as executor. He said Susan had discovered company property among Larry's personal effects after accepting the Wolf Creek parcel. He said she had then claimed ownership without notifying him. He makes the key sound stolen, Susan said. He doesn't say stolen, Peter replied. He put everything around the word, yes. Peter turned to the transferred document. Todd also says this paper was intended as full settlement of your interest in Larry's property. It doesn't say that. No. He tried to get that language later. Yes. Will he have to explain that? If he continues making the claim. Susan looked toward the stove. He will. The hearing was scheduled for the following week in Okanagan County Superior Court. Until then, Susan agreed not to sign anything with Alan. She didn't agree that Todd had authority over her. Peter wrote that distinction into his response. The tax deadline kept moving closer. Alan's company offered to place money in escrow for the delinquent amount, while the ownership dispute continued. Susan refused. She didn't want a developer paying the taxes before she had decided whether he would receive anything in return. Gary loaned her the money instead. He brought a cashier's check to the cabin and placed it beside the county notice. No, Susan said. You can pay me back. With what? The land is worth something. That's the point. I don't want you lending against it without terms. Gary sat down and wrote on the back of an envelope. Loan to Susan Hardy for Wolf Creek property taxes. No interest. Repayment when practical. No claim against land, water, cabin, business, Flask, or whatever else Larry hid. He signed beneath it. Susan read the line about the Flask. That isn't a real loan agreement. It's real enough to keep the county from taking the place. Peter later replaced the envelope with a proper note carrying the same terms. Susan signed it. They paid the delinquent taxes 3 days before the hearing. The county stamped the account current and removed the auction status. One clock stopped. Todd's remained. The morning of the hearing, Susan put on the same dark trousers she had worn to the will meeting. Her black shoes still carried fine scratches from the hospital parking garage. She left Larry's Flask at the cabin. The proof inside it had already done its work. Carrying it into court would have made it look like a symbol, and Susan needed the room to see documents. Gary drove. Lori met them outside the courthouse wearing a navy coat and carrying her original binders. Holly arrived alone. Where are Todd and Sandra? Susan asked. Inside. Did you speak to them? Todd called last night. What did he want? For me to sign a statement saying Dad always intended the family property to stay with his children. What did you say? That I couldn't know what Dad always intended. Did he ask about the company? He said it was obviously part of the family property. Did you sign anything? No. Holly's answer came without apology or explanation. It was the first clean decision Susan had heard from her. They passed through security together. The courtroom was smaller than Susan expected. Wooden benches faced a raised desk where the court commissioner would sit. A clerk arranged files at one side. Two people waiting on unrelated matters whispered near the back. Todd sat at the front table with Dale Mercer. Sandra occupied the bench directly behind them. A local real estate agent Susan recognized sat beside her with a leather portfolio. Peter noticed him too. They brought a valuation witness, he said quietly. Alan's estimate wasn't public. They don't need Alan's. Anyone can see the water filing now. The commissioner handled 2 short matters before calling the Hardy estate. Todd stood when Mercer did. Susan followed Peter to the opposite table. Mercer began with the old will. He spoke carefully, separating himself from the sharper language in Todd's filing. Larry had died owning several personal and business assets. Todd had been nominated executor. During administration, previously undisclosed property had come to light. The estate sought an orderly determination before that property could be transferred. Peter didn't interrupt. Mercer presented the estate inventory. It listed the Glover Street house, bank accounts, vehicles, guiding equipment, and personal property. A recent amendment added Larry's membership interest in Hardy Land Timber, LLC, value unknown. Susan read the line from where she sat. They had added it to the estate because Todd said it belonged there. Then they used the estate inventory as evidence that it belonged there. Peter made a note on his pad. Mercer called Todd to speak from the witness table. Todd swore to tell the truth. He began with Larry's guiding business. He had worked trips during college, maintained equipment, and expected to take over. Some of that was true. Susan remembered packing food for him before routes and washing sleeping bags he left wet in the truck. My father talked for years about keeping what he built in the family, Todd said. The will reflects that. Did you know about Hardy land and timber before his death? Mercer asked. No. When did you first learn of it? When Mrs. Hardy filed a claim to take control. Susan felt Peter's hand touch the edge of her sleeve, a quiet instruction to wait. Did she notify you before filing? No. Did she disclose the safe deposit box? No. Did she give you an opportunity to inventory its contents as executor? No. Each answer was technically true and arranged to create a false shape. Todd didn't mention that Larry had named Susan's successor renter. He didn't mention the key or the letter. He didn't mention calling the Flask junk. Mercer handed him the Wolf Creek transfer. Why did the estate convey the 40-acre parcel to Mrs. Hardy? She needed a place to live. The cabin had been in the family, but nobody had used it in years. We believed giving it to her was fair. Sandra sat very still. Holly lowered her eyes. Was the transfer meant to resolve her claim to estate property? Yes. Is that written in the document? Todd hesitated. The understanding was clear. To whom? To everyone in the room when we discussed it. Susan remembered Mercer warning that an executor couldn't ignore an asset. She remembered Holly saying the cabin had holes in its roof. She remembered Todd pointing at the tax notice and saying Susan could take it with the taxes. Mercer changed direction. Why are you asking the court to restrict Mrs. Hardy's control of the LLC property? Because my father owned the company. His will leaves his property to his family. Do you believe Mrs. Hardy has authority to sell or lease it? No. Do you believe the operating agreement changes the will? I believe Dad remained the owner until he died. Anything he owned should pass through probate. There it was, stated plainly under oath. Todd wasn't claiming confusion now. He was asking a public court to erase the successor clause and place all control with him. Mercer returned to his table. Peter could have begun with the operating agreement. He didn't. He asked Todd about the timing. When did you first contact an estate dealer? Todd looked toward Sandra. I didn't. My wife did. When? I don't know. Before or after Larry died? I believe after. Sandra's lips parted, but she couldn't answer for him. Did you have the Glover Street locks changed within a week of his death? Yes. Why so quickly? To secure estate property. From whom? Anyone without authority. Was Mrs. Hardy living there? Yes. Had she threatened to remove estate assets? No. Did you know she had somewhere habitable to go? She had Wolf Creek. Had you inspected the cabin? No. Had you confirmed electricity? No. Water? No. Condition of the roof? No. Peter lifted the release Todd had demanded. Did you ask Mrs. Hardy to sign this? Yes. Before you knew about the LLC? Yes. Why does it release unknown business and property interests? It's standard language. Why did you require it the next day? We needed to close the estate efficiently. Because probate was expensive? Yes. Or because your construction lender had given you a deadline? Mercer stood. The debts of Mr. Hardy's separate business are outside the ownership question. Peter looked toward the commissioner. They explained the urgency and the executor's claim that an unsigned release represented a full settlement. The commissioner allowed the question. Todd's jaw tightened. My company was under financial pressure. Did you intend to use estate proceeds to support it? If I inherited the proceeds, they would be mine to use. Did Sandra estimate those proceeds while Larry was still in the ICU? I don't know what calculation she made. Did she discuss selling the Glover Street house before he died? She discussed what might have to happen. Todd's control began to show strain. He had expected the old will to end the discussion. He hadn't expected each rushed choice to be placed beside the next. Peter returned to the central point. You testified that all property Larry owned at death belongs to his estate. Yes. Even property governed by a separate agreement? His will controls. Even if that agreement names a successor? I don't believe he understood what that meant. Were you present when he signed it? No. Did he ever tell you about the LLC? No. Did he ever tell you about the 120 acres? No. Did he ever tell you about the water right? No. Then on what basis do you say he didn't understand? Todd looked toward the commissioner. He was my father. I knew him. Peter let the answer remain. Mercer called the real estate agent. He testified that connected land with senior water could be worth more than $1 million, depending on confirmation and permitted use. Mercer asked whether that value justified preserving the property until the estate claim was resolved. The agent said yes. By the time he finished, Todd had committed to every part of his position in public. The LLC belonged to the estate. Susan's transfer settled her rights. Larry hadn't understood his own agreement. Todd's financial deadline had no bearing on his actions. Susan's access to the box had kept him from doing his duty. The commissioner looked toward Peter. Mr. Castro, I'm ready to hear Mrs. Hardy's evidence. Peter carried one file to the witness table. He placed Todd's estate inventory on the left. Beside it, he laid the certified 1998 deed, the state formation record, and the operating agreement. Mr. Hardy testified that this land belongs to the estate because Larry Hardy owned the company, Peter said. That skips the document controlling what happened to the membership when Larry died. He opened the agreement to the successor clause. The commissioner read it. This name's Susan Elaine Hardy, she said. Yes. As sole successor member, Mercer stood. A private agreement cannot simply defeat a valid will. No one is asking it to, Peter said. The will controls Larry's probate estate. The deed shows the 120 acres were owned by Hardy Land Timber LLC, not by Larry personally. The agreement determines who succeeds to control of that company. He moved the estate inventory beside the deed. The inventory describes Larry's interest as an estate asset. It provides no purchase record, assignment, or company document supporting that description. The certified deed shows the company bought the land in 1998. The operating agreement was signed and notarized that same year. The state archive confirms the entity remained in existence. Mrs. Hardy filed her acceptance and brought the company current. The commissioner turned to Todd's side. Do you have a later operating agreement? Mercer looked through his papers. No. A membership transfer? No. Evidence that Larry Hardy revoked the successor provision? No. Peter placed the bank's archived rental contract on top. Larry also named Susan as successor renter of the safe deposit box. He hid its key inside a machined double base in his field flask. The ICU returned that flask among his personal effects. Todd Hardy expressly declined it. Following Larry's written direction, Susan opened the box under the bank contract and found the original company papers. Todd leaned toward Mercer and whispered something. The commissioner looked at Peter. You have the letter? Peter handed up a certified copy. She read it without speaking. Then Lori took the witness chair. She explained how she had kept the books, recorded the land purchase, and separated every company expense from Larry's guiding operation. She identified her handwriting in the early ledger. What did Larry say about the successor clause? Peter asked. He said Wolf Creek was for Susan if he went first. Did he appear confused about what he was signing? No, he was annoyingly precise. A few people in the room smiled. Lori didn't. He made me read the legal description back to him twice, she continued. He wanted the adjoining land held separately. He said Todd assumed too much belonged to him already, and he didn't want Susan pushed out. Mercer asked whether Larry had mentioned his old will. Yes, Lori said. I told him to replace it. He said he would. He didn't. So Larry failed to update his estate plan. Yes. Could the company agreement have been another unfinished plan? No. He finished that one. I wrote the check for the filing fee. Peter then presented the water certificate and the current state abstract. The certificate number, place of use, and property descriptions matched. The right belonged with the LLC land and connected homestead parcel, not with the guiding equipment or the Glover Street house. He placed the county map in front of the commissioner. The 40 acres Todd had transferred sat inside the connected block. The LLC's 120 acres wrapped around it and reached the county road. Wolf Creek crossed both. Todd had entered the room, claiming Susan had taken property from the estate. His own evidence showed only that he had added the company to the inventory after discovering Susan's filing. The commissioner denied his request to restrict Susan's authority. She went further. The estate has not shown a legal basis to include Hardy Land Timber LLC or its real property in the probate inventory, she said. The inventory is to be corrected. Any further challenge will require evidence, not the executor's assumption that every interest associated with the deceased passes under the will. Todd looked down at the table. The old will still gave him what it lawfully controlled. Susan didn't take the Glover Street house back. She didn't take the guiding equipment already held in Larry's name. She took only what Larry had placed beyond Todd's reach and directed toward her. Outside the courtroom, Sandra spoke first. "This could ruin us." Susan buttoned her coat. "No. Your debts may ruin you. This land won't save you." Todd's face had gone pale. "You could sell and loan us enough to get through." "I could." Hope moved across his face too quickly. "I'm not going to. You'd let Dad's business disappear? Your construction company isn't your father's business." Holly stood beside Susan. Todd looked at his sister. "You chose her?" Holly shook her head. "I finally chose what was true." Susan didn't ask Holly for more. Peter arranged for the estate inventory to be corrected. Todd didn't appeal. His lender took control of some construction equipment, and Todd sold one unfinished house at a loss. He and Sandra kept their home by refinancing it. The consequence was serious, but it belonged to the decisions they had made. Alan returned to Peter's office with a different proposal. Susan refused any permanent transfer of the water right. She agreed to consider a limited seasonal lease after Peter added withdrawal limits, monitoring requirements, restoration duties, and an automatic end if Cascade Crest violated them. The final agreement brought enough annual income to secure the taxes, maintain the land, repay Gary, and restore the cabin. Susan kept all 160 acres. Work began after the thaw. Gary replaced the damaged roof with standing seam metal. Susan worked from the ground, measuring boards, sorting fasteners, and refusing every contractor who suggested covering the original cabin walls with plastic siding. They repaired the porch, rewired the bedrooms, and installed a water filter beneath the kitchen sink. Susan sanded the old table until Larry's father's knife marks appeared through the grime. She left them visible. Lori set up new company books at that table. This time, Susan knew every account and signed every filing. Part of the old guiding shed became the office for Hardy Wolf Creek Trails. Susan didn't try to rebuild the large operation Todd had taken. She opened a smaller trail outfitting service with Gary, offering equipment rental, route planning, and guided day trips for adults who wanted a slower pace through the valley. The first customers arrived on a clear June morning. Susan checked their packs, removed 2 unnecessary cooking pots, and showed them how quickly weather could change above the tree line. Gary watched from the doorway. "You still know how to make people leave half their belongings behind," he said. "They'll thank me uphill." Holly came some Saturdays. At first, Susan gave her jobs that didn't require trust, washing rental cups, updating trail notices, and sweeping the shed. They talked about weather and bookings. One afternoon, Holly asked for a key. Susan didn't answer immediately. "I'm not ready for that," she said. Holly nodded. All right, she came back the next Saturday anyway. By autumn, Susan gave her a key to the equipment shed, not the cabin. It was a beginning, and both women understood its size. A reporter from the local weekly asked to write about the property. Susan agreed after insisting that the article explain the water history and Larry's work. The first proof arrived with a headline Susan read aloud to Gary. Gary looked up from a broken snowshoe binding. "That's a lot for one flask. It did hold the key. You did the rest." Susan kept the article in the office but refused to frame it. She framed Larry's photograph instead, the one showing him beside his father at the well. By the second winter, the cabin held heat through the coldest nights. Snow rested evenly on the new roof. The porch light reached the full length of the steps. Susan's suitcase remained beneath the bed until one quiet evening when she pulled it into the main room. Only a few things were left inside: Larry's green fleece, hospital parking receipts, and the old Glover Street key. She folded the fleece into a cedar drawer. The receipts went into the stove. She placed the useless key in an envelope with the corrected estate inventory, not as a keepsake, but as a record. Then she stored the suitcase empty in the attic. If stories about reclaiming dignity after family abandonment matter to you, subscribe and return for the next inheritance story. The following morning, Susan rose before Gary arrived. She filled Larry's field flask at the kitchen tap and set it on the shelf above his photograph. Outside, fresh snow covered the meadow. Wolf Creek moved beneath a thin rim of ice. Susan switched on the porch lamp, unlocked the trail office, and turned the cabin key once behind her. Then she sat at the restored table while coffee warmed on the stove and waited for the first knock at home.